Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Hallelujah.
Please be seated. Our Holy Gospel today comes from John, the 11th chapter. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed Jesus with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother was sick. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But having heard it, Jesus said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though he loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days in the place where he was. After this, he said to his disciples, "Let us go again to Judea." His disciples said to him, "Lord, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going back there?" He answered them, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, for they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going to awaken him." They said to him, "Lord, if he's fallen asleep, then he'll be all right." Jesus had been talking about his death, but they thought he was talking merely about sleep. So then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, who was called the Twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, so that we may die with him." Now when Jesus came to Bethany, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. And Bethany was near to Jerusalem, some 2 miles away. So many of the Jews came to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out and met him, but Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, he will give to you." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." She said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." He said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though they die, will live. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." Having said this, she went back and called to her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling you." Having heard this, Mary got up quickly and went out. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who were in the house with her, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out, they followed her, because they thought she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary saw Jesus and came to the place where he was, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. And he said to them, "Where have you laid him?" They said, "Come, Lord, and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not the one who opened the eyes of the man born blind have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, still greatly distressed, came to the tomb. Now it was in a cave, and there was a stone laying against the entrance. Jesus said to them, "Take away the stone." But Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, there is already a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd gathered here, so that they might believe that you have sent me." Having said this, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out. His hands and his feet were bound with strips of cloth, and there was a cloth covering his face. So Jesus told them, "Unbind him and let him go." So many of the Jews who had come with Mary and had seen what he did believed in him. This is the gospel of our Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. So there's a funny thing about the Gospel of John. In this gospel, Jesus is portrayed a lot differently than he is in the other 3. Jesus almost seems to be walking a few inches off the ground throughout this gospel. Like he can't quite step into the dirt and the muck that the rest of us are living in. In fact, I had a professor in college, Dr. Beck, who used to say that in John's gospel, even at the crucifixion, hanging on the cross, Jesus is in charge of the whole show. He gives instructions to his disciples, he gives speeches, and he only dies in the moment when he chooses to give up his spirit. In our text today, Jesus seems to be removed from the emotions, the reality of the situation facing the people around him. He seems to be above them, oblivious to them, or simply beyond these emotions, thinking into the future instead of about the present. But as strange as this can seem to us, it gives a really great contrast between how Jesus behaves in this situation and how the rest of the characters in the story behave. The rest of them exhibit very real human emotions that we can identify with pretty easily. We have Martha, who in her grief over her brother lashes out in anger, trying to find someone to blame for what has happened. We have Mary, who is so overcome with grief she doesn't notice her sister leaving the house and only manages to get one sentence out to the rabbi. We have the disciples who spend the entire text confused about what Jesus is talking about and doing, whether they should be grieving or rejoicing, and they also are concerned about the safety of their rabbi, who is choosing to go back to the place where people were trying to stone him. Then finally we have the rest of the Jews, those who had come to help Martha and Mary, to mourn with them and to console them during this time. They seem to have mixed emotions. They're probably more or less invested in grieving, more or less invested in Lazarus, and and more or less invested in what Jesus has come to do. What's interesting about this story is we most often hear it called the resurrection of Lazarus or the raising of Lazarus or something along those lines. And yet almost the entire text takes place in grief and pain and the suffering that comes because Lazarus is dead. I was curious about how long it took to tell this story, so I timed it, and it's about 7.5 minutes. And I would guess about 15 seconds of that involves Lazarus raised from the dead. He never speaks again, not here or in the next chapter when he appears again. All he does is come out of the tomb. It's about 3 verses of the written text where Lazarus is alive. This text is one of grief. It's one of pain. It's about the reality of life when we lose a loved one. And only at the very, very end does the good news come. Jesus enters this place of grief and pain, goes amongst these people who are angry and upset and unsure about what to do next. And he seems to be beyond it or above it. The first thing he says to Mary when she complains that he wasn't there to help is, "Your brother will rise again." Now maybe it was said flippantly or maybe it was said with deep gravity, but no matter what, it still comes off as some sort of platitude, some sort of way of calming her down from her grief, some sort of way of saying, "Don't worry about that. You know what's coming." It probably sounded a lot along the lines of when people tell those who are grieving, "Well, God needed another angel in heaven," or "It must have been his time." These kinds of words are no comfort to those who are deep in the pits of grief. And it doesn't sound like what Jesus said was any comfort to Martha either. For she says, I know he'll rise again in the last day, but it's not helping now. What Jesus seems to miss in what he says is what's happening right now. Lazarus is dead, and no promise of the resurrection, either soon or in some distant future, is going to change the fact that he is dead now. Lazarus is dead, and Martha is looking for someone to blame. In this text, she lashes out at Jesus. "If only you had been here." But certainly she's done this more than once, right? If only the doctor had come sooner. If only we had known better. If only I had done everything right. My brother would not have died. Lazarus is dead. And that is the situation of this text. Maybe you find yourself in one of these characters. Maybe you are in a place of grief where you are angry and looking to lash out at someone, anyone, even the Lord. Maybe you are so deep in grief that you can't even notice what's going on around you. Maybe you're confused about whether you should be grieving or not, or about the whole situation. Or maybe you're a little bit removed from the situation, like that group of Jews, and you're trying to help those who are enmeshed in it. Or maybe, just maybe, you're like Jesus, with the promise of resurrection sure in your heart and in your mind. And maybe you're trying to push others to that same place a little faster than they're ready to be. You see, nothing will change the fact that the resurrection is real, that the promise is sure, that our God is the God who raises new life from what was dead. But at the same time, nothing changes the very real grief and pain and suffering that is happening in this place, in our community, and throughout the world right now. We know the promise of Easter. We know how this story ends. And yet, we walk the road to Jerusalem with Jesus right now. It's no mistake that we celebrate Easter during spring, when we can look around us and literally see resurrection and new life springing forth around us. And yet, right now, we are walking in the valley of the shadow of death. And even as new life springs forth, we can see the death too. Jesus knows the end of this story of Lazarus. Jesus knows the end of his own story. Jesus knows the end of the grand story of creation and God's work in it. And yet, in this story, Jesus weeps. Maybe he weeps because of the pain of those around him. Maybe he weeps for Lazarus' loss and the pain he feels from that. Or maybe he weeps because he knows that he is going to go and raise Lazarus, and that very act will be the thing that leads to his own crucifixion and death. The resurrection and life himself weeps here. So the good news of this text for us today is, for one, that the resurrection is sure. But the other good news is that when we cannot get to that place of hope, when we cannot yet accept that the resurrection and new life are real both here and now and in the future, God is still with us. God is with us in our places of deepest pain and grief and suffering. God is with us, and more than that, God weeps too. When we are in pain, God feels that pain. God walks beside us. God knows what it is like. And God patiently calls, waits, and brings us hope until that day when we can hear it. Thanks be to God. Amen.